how a king turned power into a death sentence. Joffrey inherited gold, soldiers, a famous name, and the Iron Throne. Within a few years, almost everyone around him had a reason to feel relief when he died. The tempting answer is the theatrical one. The useful answer is harder. Joffrey mistakes humiliation for authority, and every public display of cruelty spends political capital his family cannot afford to lose. We shall test that claim against chronology, institutions, geography, and cost. Stay with the argument, because the detail that appears least dramatic at the beginning will become the decisive weakness by the end. A crown with a crack in it. We begin with the condition that makes every later choice possible. Remove it, and the drama changes entirely. The proper place to begin is the record itself. Rumours that Joffrey is Jaime Lannister's son make the new king's legitimacy fragile from the start. This is not decorative law, it fixes the initial distribution of risk. Before assigning motive, one must ask what each participant knew, what they could plausibly refuse, and what punishment followed. A mistaken calculation. A crown with a crack in it becomes intelligible only when those constraints are kept in view. The implication is that Joffrey mistakes humiliation for authority, and every public display of cruelty spends political capital his family cannot afford to lose. Yet the danger is not fully visible at first. The arrangement appears stable precisely because its costs have been shifted onto people with little voice. The next question is whether those costs remain dispersed or suddenly acquire a banner, a leader, and an opportunity to answer. A skeptic might object that this places too much weight upon one detail. The objection is useful but not decisive. The argument does not depend upon the detail acting alone. It depends upon the way it confirms the pattern established by a crown with a crack in it. One clue may be coincidence. Several clues pointing towards the same incentive are evidence. The distinction keeps the conclusion proportionate while preserving its force. A second piece of evidence sharpens the matter. Robert Baratheon's death creates a succession crisis at the precise moment the court needs restraint and continuity. The point deserves precision because Westerosi politics rewards confident overstatement right up to the moment it becomes fatal. The text supports a firm conclusion about leverage, though not necessarily every intention later attributed to the people involved. That distinction will matter when the apparent victor discovers the price of success. From this follows a measured conclusion. A crown with a crack in it changes the incentives surrounding the next decision. It does not guarantee one outcome, but it makes conciliation harder and opportunism more attractive. In political history, that is often enough. A realm may stumble into catastrophe without any participant having planned the final shape of it. For a spoken analysis, this is the moment to reopen the central question rather than rush onward. If the apparent solution creates more enemies, higher costs, and fewer trustworthy institutions, in what sense was it successful? The answer cannot be supplied by the character's confidence. It must be found in the conditions inherited by the next decision-maker who receives the consequences without the luxury of rewriting their origin. Now consider the material condition beneath the heraldry. Joffrey dismisses Sir Barristan Selmy, humiliating a living symbol of royal service and teaching veterans that loyalty can be discarded on a whim. Titles and vows may explain how authority is presented, but food, distance, ships, hostages, and armed retainers determine how authority travels. George R.R. Martin repeatedly places splendid language over stubborn logistics. When the two disagree, logistics usually has the final word, often with regrettable consequences for anyone wearing ceremonial silk. This material reading also explains why rhetoric alone cannot repair the damage. Once resources, routes, or bodies have been spent, a proclamation cannot conjure them back. The governing class may continue speaking in the language of honor, but the ledger has already adopted a rather less romantic vocabulary. The historical comparison is not with modern government in every respect, but with the recurring problem of pre-modern states. Authority is personal, information slow, and enforcement expensive. Under those conditions, reputation substitutes for bureaucracy. A broken promise, therefore, travels farther than the immediate victim. It informs every lord, merchant, captain and household, deciding whether the next royal instruction is a command, a negotiation, or merely an opening bid. That foundation is now in place. The next section shows who learns to exploit it. This opening movement also establishes the standard by which the rest of Joffrey Baratheon, how a king turned power into a death sentence, should be judged. Power must do more than produce a striking scene. It must preserve options, coordinate people, and survive the response it provokes. The apparent masterstroke has not yet faced that test. Keep the original vulnerability in mind, because the next section will show how an opponent, an institution, or simple material reality converts it into leverage. The death of Ned Stark. The second movement concerns mechanism, not what the actors claim to be doing, but how power is actually transmitted. The human evidence is equally important. Cersei and the Council need Ned alive as a hostage and bargaining chip after his arrest. A court may describe the result as policy, justice, honor, or necessity. Those living beneath it experience hunger, fear, bereavement, and lost choices. This difference of vocabulary is central to the death of Ned Stark. Political power is at its most revealing when the official explanation sounds orderly, while the private cost is anything but. The cost borne below eventually returns upward. Hunger becomes disorder, grief becomes vengeance, and private resentment becomes a recruitment network. That conversion provides the narrative engine for the next section. What looked like background suffering is about to become an active political force. Visually, one might place the splendid public image beside the unglamorous mechanism that sustains it. Show the crown, then the bread queue, the warship, then the timber yard, the feast, then the empty chair. The contrast supplies pace without sacrificing accuracy. It reminds the viewer that Martin's politics operates through two simultaneous realities: what power wishes to look like and what power requires other people to provide. There is, however, a limit to what may responsibly be claimed. Joffrey overrides the planned mercy and orders Ned's public execution, despite Sansa's hopes and his advisor's calculations. The detail permits inference, not clairvoyance. Where the novels leave motive, scale, or mechanism uncertain, a rigorous account should say so. Restraint does not diminish the drama. On the contrary, separating textual evidence from fan theory allows the genuine ambiguity to do its proper work. The uncertainty is itself significant. Characters must act without the complete knowledge available to a reader comparing chapters. Their choices should therefore be judged against information they possessed, not information they could not possess. The surprise is not that mistakes occur, but that pride so often prevents correction when contrary evidence finally arrives. Nor should the moral vocabulary be dismissed as camouflage in every instance. Honor, faith, kinship, and duty can genuinely motivate these characters. The stricter point is that sincere belief does not cancel material consequence. Indeed, belief may make escalation more dangerous by persuading a person that compromise would be spiritual failure rather than practical adjustment. Conviction explains persistence. It does not guarantee wisdom. The chronology now becomes decisive. That single spectacle hardens the North, poisons any chance of a negotiated settlement, and makes Robb Stark's war a war of vengeance. Placed earlier or later, the same act might carry a different meaning. Here it follows a sequence of threats, failed bargains, and narrowing alternatives. History in Westeros rarely turns on an isolated outburst. It turns when accumulated decisions make moderation appear more dangerous than escalation. Chronology thus converts personality into policy. A rash act creates a hostile response. The response justifies a harsher act. Soon both sides describe escalation as defense. The mechanism is sober, cumulative, and far more persuasive than attributing an entire war to one villainous temperament. This also offers a useful retention turn for the audience. The obvious villain may not be the decisive cause. Systems can reward bad choices without requiring a mastermind. Once the incentives favor cruelty, secrecy, or short-term plunder, removing one cruel, secretive, or reckless individual leaves the machinery largely intact. The next occupant may be gentler and still discover that the available levers point in the same direction. The mechanism works, but only by consuming the trust on which it depends. That bill is about to fall due. We may now state the mechanism plainly. Joffrey mistakes humiliation for authority, and every public display of cruelty spends political capital his family cannot afford to lose. The arrangement succeeds in the short term because the first costs are hidden, delayed, or imposed upon people outside the decision. That is excellent material for a dramatic reversal, the very factor dismissed as secondary returns with accumulated force. The coming question is not whether the system can command obedience once, but whether it can continue doing so after everyone understands the price. Ye drool as theatre. At the midpoint, appearances become dangerous. The system still looks stable, yet its internal contradictions are now doing active damage. One should also attend to the audience inside the scene. Joffrey uses Sansa's suffering as a public prop, treating a high-value political hostage as a target for personal amusement. Allies, servants, rivals, and smallfolk do not merely witness power, they learn from it. Each public decision teaches them whether loyalty will be rewarded, neutrality tolerated, and surrender honored. Rule as theatre therefore alters future behavior long before it produces an obvious military result. Reputation now becomes a strategic asset or liability. Observers do not need to admire a ruler, but they must be able to predict the ruler's conduct. Once predictability collapses, allies demand greater rewards, enemies refuse surrender, and neutral houses wait for safer weather. Authority remains visible while its usable value quietly drains away. The counterfactual test clarifies the claim. Imagine the opposite choice, the hostage preserved, the advisor retained, the road protected, the bargain honored, or the supply stored. Not every disaster disappears, but the range of peaceful options remains wider. That is enough to establish significance. Political competence is rarely the power to guarantee success. It is the discipline to avoid manufacturing failures that were not otherwise inevitable. Geography supplies the next constraint. Tyrion repeatedly has to contain the king's impulses because the crown's image is becoming an operational liability. Maps are not neutral illustrations in this world. Roads, rivers, ports, mountains, weather, and sailing time convert ambition into a timetable, and a timetable into vulnerability. Any claim that ignores those facts may sound magnificent at council, but it is unlikely to survive contact with mud, winter, or an unpaid wagoner. The map therefore places a hard ceiling on fantasy. A fleet may possess courage without water, an army banners without grain, and a city walls without a secure road. None of those contradictions lasts gracefully. The approaching reversal begins when the characters discover that geography has declined to participate in their preferred story. One must also distinguish strategic value from absolute necessity. A port may be important without controlling an entire sea, a marriage useful without securing a dynasty, fear effective without constituting stable rule. Such distinctions sound modest, yet they prevent the analysis from turning a strong point into a brittle one. Precision is not caution for its own sake. It is what allows the argument to survive a knowledgeable viewer's objection. The economic reading is no less severe. Tywin's later instructions reveal the family's real assessment. Joffrey may wear the crown, but he cannot be trusted with the consequences of power. Wealth is useful only when it can be converted into food, labor, transport, information, or loyalty at the required moment. Hoarded prestige cannot feed a city, repair a fleet, or replace trained men. Rule as theatre exposes the distance between appearing rich and possessing the resources necessary to endure a crisis. Economically, the policy resembles borrowing against a future that may never arrive. Immediate prestige is purchased with resilience, and resilience is only noticed once it has gone. The political class calls the shortage unexpected. Everyone who carried, caught, grew, or paid for the missing supply may reasonably disagree. At the level of ordinary life, the same issue appears as time. How many days can a household wait for grain, a garrison for pay, a captive family for news, or a sailor for weather? Great lords speak in generations, but crises arrive by the hour. The gap between those timescales produces much of the pressure in rule as theatre, and it explains why a small delay can provoke a disproportionately large political reaction. The facade has held, the structure beneath it has not. We now turn to the moment the difference becomes public. At the midpoint, a less careful account would declare the outcome inevitable. It is not. Contingency remains. Different weather, better advice, one honoured bargain, or one timely concession might alter events. Yet contingency does not absolve incompetence. The responsible conclusion is that the central development has made the dangerous outcome more probable and the peaceful outcome more expensive. That narrower claim is sufficiently grave and considerably harder to refute. A city that hates its king. The fourth movement raises the cost. A private calculation expands into a military, economic, or dynastic problem that no speech can neatly contain. Here, the symbolism and the politics meet. King's Landing depends on food, order, and the belief that the royal household can protect ordinary people. The image works because it condenses a broader struggle into something visible, yet symbolism should not be mistaken for a substitute explanation. Its value lies in showing how the characters understand the act, as warning, revenge, legitimacy, sacrilege, or proof that an older order has failed. Symbolically, the act announces more than its author intends. A display meant to communicate strength may reveal fear. A ritual meant to restore order may advertise that ordinary law no longer functions. The most powerful image in a city that hates its king is therefore double-edged, and the next section follows the wound it leaves behind. There is an additional question of selection. Chroniclers and point-of-view characters notice spectacular acts more readily than maintenance, repaired walls, counted stores, trained clerks, reliable ferries, predictable justice. Yet maintenance is the substance of durable rule. The absence becomes visible only at failure. A rigorous account therefore gives weight to what did not happen, particularly the quiet preparations that might have prevented the celebrated catastrophe. The institutional evidence is particularly damning. During the bread riot, hunger and rage reach the royal party directly. Joffrey answers civic distress with contempt. A durable regime depends upon offices, customs, and people who continue functioning when the ruler is absent or foolish. Personal command may produce obedience for an afternoon. Institutions preserve capacity over years. When a sovereign humiliates the very structures that sustain the crown, the damage is strategic rather than merely impolite. Institutional damage is rarely cinematic at the moment it occurs. A veteran dismissed, a custom mocked, or an advisor ignored may seem minor beside a battle. Yet those losses remove memory and restraint from the system. When the emergency arrives, the crown discovers that experience was not ornamental after all. The dynastic consequence deserves emphasis. A ruler does not merely govern subjects, he or she shapes the inheritance of successors. Debts, feuds, precedents, and damaged offices pass down as surely as castles. Joffrey mistakes humiliation for authority, and every public display of cruelty spends political capital. His family cannot afford to lose matters because it changes that inheritance. The next generation begins its reign with less freedom, then may be blamed for failing to solve a crisis designed before it possessed either voice or authority. At this stage, the moral argument cannot be separated from reciprocity. A ruler can use fear to deter enemies, but he cannot eat fear, unload grain with fear, or hold a city during siege with fear alone. Westerosi society is violent, but it is not without rules. Guest right, oath, ransom, inheritance, and protection create expectations that allow enemies to negotiate without every meeting becoming a massacre. Break those expectations often enough, and even victory becomes more expensive because nobody can safely believe the next promise. Reciprocity explains why revenge can feel just and still make the realm worse. Punishment may satisfy memory while teaching every faction that rules apply only until anger becomes persuasive. The unresolved issue is whether justice can be restored by repeating the violation that destroyed it. This is where justice and effectiveness may part company. An act can feel deserved and still be strategically ruinous. It can be strategically useful and still corrode the norms that make future peace possible. Westeros offers few pure choices, but impurity is not an excuse to stop judging. It is a reason to state the competing goods plainly and ask which cost the decision-maker knowingly imposed upon others. The crisis has outgrown personal intention. What follows is the reckoning in resources, loyalty, and memory. The fourth movement should quicken the narration because separate pressures now converge. Political reputation affects military loyalty. Military movement strains supply. Supply failure unsettles civilians. Civilian disorder weakens legitimacy. None of these forces operates alone. Their interaction is the climax. What appear to be several manageable difficulties becomes one crisis with multiple entrances, ensuring that solving a single symptom cannot restore the earlier balance. A legacy erased at the wedding. The final movement asks the only historical question that matters: what remained after the principal actors believed the matter settled? The military consequence follows naturally. The Tyrell marriage gives Joffrey an enormous chance to stabilize the regime, but it also places him among allies with the means to remove him. Armies are not chess pieces waiting in perfect condition. They consist of hungry people, animals, quarrelsome commanders, fragile roots, and households calculating whether the cause remains worth its losses. A legacy erased at the wedding matters because it changes those calculations, sometimes before a single formal battle is fought. Military power must consequently be assessed as endurance, not spectacle. The side that can replace losses, preserve supply, maintain alliances, and offer credible terms may defeat a more dramatic opponent. A legacy erased at the wedding matters because it reveals which side is consuming its future merely to survive the present. For commanders, the lesson is brutally simple. Every plan contains an assumption about human behavior. Men will march, allies will remain loyal, merchants will sell, enemies will panic, and subjects will endure. A legacy erased at the wedding tests those assumptions. When even one proves false, the physical plan begins to unravel. Strategy is therefore not merely movement across a map, it is prediction about people under pressure, an art at which pride performs remarkably poorly. The psychological evidence must be handled with similar care. At the Purple Wedding, his death is followed less by a universal cry for justice than by rapid efforts to preserve the dynasty through Tommen. The novels reveal behavior, memory, and speech, not a modern clinical file. It is fair to describe grief, fear, pride, or isolation where the text sustains them. It is less sound to present a diagnosis as settled fact. The character is more interesting when contradiction remains visible. Psychologically, the contradiction prevents a simple hero or monster verdict. The character's fear may be genuine, the strategy intelligent, and the result indefensible. Keeping all three propositions together produces a stronger analysis than choosing whichever one best suits an existing allegiance. For the viewer, the emotional payoff comes from recognizing the earlier warning after the reversal occurs. The scene should therefore echo its opening image without repeating it verbatim. What first appeared to be security is revealed as dependence. What looked like weakness becomes patience. What seemed ceremonial proves operational. That callback creates the satisfying sense that the conclusion was surprising in timing, but present in the evidence all along. Finally, note what survives the immediate event. Tommen's succession works as a reset because Joffrey has created no durable personal network, policy, or achievement worth defending. The political afterlife of a decision may be longer than the reign, feast, campaign, or voyage that produced it. Stories travel, grievances harden, and younger heirs inherit conclusions before they inherit land. That is how private conduct becomes historical structure in Westeros. The afterlife of the act is the final measure of its importance. If it changes what later characters believe about loyalty, safety, or legitimacy, it has entered the realm's political memory. The scene ends, the incentive remains. That lingering incentive is where the final reckoning begins. The final test is memory. Ask not only who won the immediate contest, but what story survivors will tell about it. If they remember betrayal, humiliation, hunger, or abandonment, that memory becomes political capital for somebody else. In this fashion, a legacy erased at the wedding supplies, the motive force for events beyond its own pages. The past does not control the future completely, but it sets the price at which future loyalty may be purchased. The immediate contest ends here. Its political consequences do not, which is why the verdict must be larger than victory or defeat. The last movement returns us to the promise made in the opening. We asked whether the impressive act produced durable power. The answer must be found in what others can safely do after it: trade, surrender, speak honestly, plan for winter, or trust the next agreement. If those ordinary actions have become harder, the victory was partly an illusion. The realm may applaud the spectacle, but history will record the capacity that disappeared beneath it. 1. The final reckoning. What then is the verdict on Joffrey Baratheon, how a king turned power into a death sentence? The evidence does not offer a tidy moral, and it would be un-British to pretend that a loud conclusion is necessarily a sound one. The stronger finding is structural. The choices examined here concentrate authority while quietly reducing resilience, trust, or freedom of action. The delay between cause and recognition supplies the tragedy. Characters believe they have secured themselves, only to discover that their protection has narrowed the future they hope to command. That is why this subject endures. It works as political history, as character tragedy, and as a warning about the distance between a gesture of strength and actual security. The banners, crowns, feasts, ships, vows, and coins are never merely decoration. They are promises made visible. When the promise fails, everyone in the room feels the collapse. The question to leave in the comments is not simply whether the principal character was right or wrong. Ask which alternative remained available at each stage, who lost it, and who paid for the display of power. In Westeros, the answer is very rarely the person seated nearest the throne.